From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown, and my guest today is James Rodgers. James is the author of The Return of Russia, From Yeltsin to Putin, The Story of a Vengeful Kremlin. James has reported on Russia since the end of the Soviet period for both the BBC and Reuters, including as a war correspondent during the First Chechen War. He now teaches journalism at City St. George's, University of London. Here is the book. And if you turn it around to show the spine, it has the Putin version of the Eye of Sauron, which will stare at you from your bookshelf. And if you look at the cover again, he's looking kind of jowly. He's looking a little bit like those Soviet leaders who preceded Gorbachev. You know, the so-called hearse race of old guys.
Well, I think he is. I mean, he's obviously into his eighth decade now. And of course, the thing about Gorbachev was that he was hailed at the time as a new young leader, only his mid-50s at the time that he came to office, and kicked off the whole reform program, which led, of course, to the end of the Soviet Union, which arguably, in turn, led to the situation in which we find ourselves today with the war in Ukraine, because in many ways, Roland, of course, that's unfinished business from more than 3 decades ago. You know, Ukraine's various attempts to remove itself from Russia's orbit since the end of the Soviet period have led us to where, you know, we found ourselves firstly in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, thereafter the war in the Donbass, and then, of course, almost exactly 4 years ago, the escalation of that war with Russia's attempt to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Right. So let's start at the beginning. Christmas Day, 1991, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev resigns and the Soviet Union is dissolved the next day. U.S. President George H.W. Bush, on his Christmas Day message, calls the collapse a victory for democracy and freedom. He says he looks forward to working with with Russia's president, Boris Yeltsin, on bringing democratic and market reforms to Russia. In your book, you write about what you call the failure to build a better relationship between Russia and the West, going back to the Yeltsin period. During that period, Russians experienced rising poverty, crime, instability, and the concentration of the country's wealth in the hands of oligarchs. Throughout much of the era, Bush's successor, Bill Clinton, was seen to boost Yeltsin almost no matter what, including when Yeltsin shelled the Russian parliament in 1993 and changed the constitution in his favor. The U.S. response to the First Chechen War, beginning in 1994, was also muted. What were the main Western illusions of that era? What unpleasant facts should have been faced?
I think that's quite a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think I'd preface that by saying that Western hubris, and there was a degree of hubris, a degree of self-satisfaction, was actually quite understandable in the sense that if you think about the Cold War that dominated not just Europe, but the whole of the world for the second half of the last century, well, most of it up until the late 1980s, early 1990s, depending on when you consider the end of that conflict. One system survived and one did not. Soviet-style socialism did not survive. Liberal democratic capitalism, for want of a better phrase, did survive. And I think there was a belief then, and I think this is where the West's mistakes possibly began, but as I say, there were mitigating circumstances. It was understandable. And I think there was also a tremendous amount of relief on all sides of the Cold War conflict that conflict was over. But there was another emotion, I think, too, on the Russian-Soviet side, which was a feeling of humiliation. But I'm sure we'll come on to that a little later. But I think the feeling was that the Western system had triumphed. Mm-hmm. And the world that was going to follow was going to be one in which everybody would more or less adapt that system, because it was the best system, the best political and economic system that humanity had yet come up with. And that was evidenced by its triumph in the Cold War. And so that was the idea that this was the way the world was going to be in the future. And I think Western policymakers then set about building a world on that basis. Mm-hmm. But I think, if from everybody's perspective, to a large extent, it was a world built by the West From a Russian perspective, it was also a world built for the West. And I don't think Western policymakers, with some of those very important incidents that you mentioned, Roland, like I would particularly highlight the shelling of the Parliament in October 1993. I don't think Western policymakers fully took into account what the consequences of that might be. All that said, looking through the archives here in London, some of the diplomatic correspondence available at that time, there was an understanding that the new constitution, as was drawn up and was passed by a referendum, but by a public vote in December 1993, would be quite a formidable weapon in the wrong hands. And so in many ways it has proved to be subsequently.
Right. So you write in the book that there was a sense that there was no alternative other than going back to a more hostile regime, backed by the possibility of a nuclear standoff, which is oddly where we are, more or less where we are now.
It is. I mean, I think it was so unthinkable then that it could be. I mean, I think if we take the example of the 1996 Russian presidential election, Yeltsin had won very huge share of the popular vote in 1991. 1991, that's the summer where he stands up on the tank to express his opposition, and he acts as a figurehead for opposition to an attempt to reverse the tide of reform by hardline communists. That eventually collapses. But what Yeltsin inherits and what leads him into confrontation with the parliament, he inherits a parliament that was elected from the era before, still from the Soviet era, and which has a lot of nationalists in, a lot of communists in, who are very, very opposed to the reforms and particularly to the hardships which they're causing. I mean, we've got mass inflation, we've got people losing jobs, we've got people losing their savings as well. In the 1990s, there was hyperinflation in 1992 when prices were first freed. Later in the same decade, we've got Russia defaults on its domestic debt and people lose their savings in mass inflation once again. So a very, very difficult time. And Yeltsin, again, possibly, with a lot of help from the West, certainly in terms of political counselors, in terms of funding, manages against all odds to win the election in 1996. But he has in effect been forgiven for turning his guns on the parliament. And I think a lot of people didn't really foresee what the longer term consequences of that might be. And I also argue in the book that that was the point at which it became acceptable to solve political disputes in Russia with violence. So I think, there's one school of thought which will say, look, the 1990s is much more harmonious time. You mentioned President Bill Clinton, of course. He had such a warm personal relationship with Boris Yeltsin. It was called the Bill and Boris show because, they would share jokes when they're in public together. But at the same time, there were serious trends happening which were threatening to undermine the relationship. And I argue in the book, on the basis of my research, particularly at the National Archives of the United States in Maryland, some of the information that the United States was collecting then to try to fathom public opinion in Russia, and indeed elite opinion, says to me that renewed confrontation was already inevitable by the end of the 1990s. It was just a question then of what form that would take. And then, of course, at the end of the 1990s, last day of the decade, last day of the century, last day of the millennium, Yeltsin resigns, and under the terms of the Russian constitution, Vladimir Putin, then prime minister, becomes acting president.
Mm-hmm. Before we get on to the succession, you mentioned archives a couple of times. So you were there during the 1990s. You saw it. You have your own memories of it. How did you go about piecing that period together historically in archives?
Well, it's interesting because obviously the period I've written about is from 1991 up to 2022. Now, because of the way that these things work, most of the archives, the diplomatic papers are not available from the later period. There's quite a lot available from the 1990s. There's the diplomatic correspondence between the British Embassy in Moscow and a lot between the US Embassy in Moscow and their respective capitals. One really interesting set of documents that I found was a series of opinion polls conducted by the United States Information Agency, which collected information. This agency no longer exists. It existed from the 1950s up until the late 1990s, so very much a sort of Cold War era institution. And they collected opinions amongst ordinary Russians about a very wide variety of things. Because remember, one of the points about the end of the Cold War was this was a tremendous economic opportunity for American businesses. I even found one which conducted what people made of different brands of American cigarettes. And it's interesting too. It's a very different world, of course, but one of the things when the Soviet economy was really collapsing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was even one occasion when there was almost civil unrest in one Russian provincial town because of the lack of availability of cigarettes. So Western countries even sent cigarettes as aid. So you can imagine, a time when many more people smoked, people going through a very stressful time. Cigarettes were a very big part of it, but they were also a massive, potential new market for international US-based cigarette brands. Aside from the consumer things, there were opinion polls conducted on various sensitive, potentially political issues. It makes really interesting reading now, Roland, for the reason that a lot of them really quite clearly foretell where the fracture points would lie. That is NATO enlargement or expansion. Interesting for me during this research, in the 1990s, including by memoirs of senior diplomats, those two words about NATO's taking in of new members after the end of the Cold War, expansion or enlargement, they are used almost interchangeably. Now, of course, subsequently, which your choice of word reflects more or less your opinion on whether or not it was a good idea or not. Expansion is used by critics who suggest that this was about the alliance taking in countries more or less against their will. Enlargement is used by those people who would think it was a good thing for European and global security in the sense that they were welcoming in new voluntary members. But it's interesting to note these opinion polls that were conducted with members of the Russian elites, that being scientists, leading academics, politicians, members of the military. They foresaw Russia's relations with Ukraine and NATO's welcoming of new members as a real fracture point. Some other really interesting things too. They did some surveys of the military and the number of officers who were not getting paid. I mean, the researchers did a fantastic job in terms of finding out where the sensitive issues might be. But it makes really, really interesting reading, 30 odd years on, because it pretty much predicted where the confrontation would come when it did.
That is one of the striking things about the book, that so much information on Russian public opinion was known, and we assume would have been accessible to Western leaders. So, in a sense, there shouldn't have been many surprises.
That's right. I mean, that's a big question I was left facing in doing the book. But I mean, I think there's another way of looking at it, I suppose. I think people perhaps felt, Western policymakers felt a number of things. They felt, everybody has benefited from the end of the Cold War. There's no going back to that era. And also, there's no society in the world that goes through the massive social and political change that Russia did at the end of the Soviet period without, it's never a smooth ride. And, so perhaps the view was, and as I say, this is reflected in places, concerns about Yeltsin shelling the parliament, but there was no major, it was never portrayed as a fracture of the relationship, nor was the first war in Chechnya either, with, tens, hundreds, possibly as many as 100,000 civilian casualties. I think there was a sort of understanding that this is the kind of unrest, the kind of turbulence through which a society will go when it's undergoing massive revolutionary change. And also, if we think about this generation of policymakers and this generation of electorates and publics, everyone remembered the Cold War very well, particularly the very hot phase it had gone through in the 1980s when there was considerable rearmament. And I think there was a feeling that, we will do pretty much what we can not to go back there. We're very, very keen to avoid that, which is why when it comes to the 1996 presidential election and Yeltsin's polling is on the floor, the West does all it can to help him because they think, he may not be perfect, but we can see a future with him in a way that we couldn't perhaps if the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov has triumphed, which might arguably have been a fairer result at the time. We will never know.
Right. At the end of 1999, Yeltsin resigns. There's been substantial political openness in Russia, especially in the media, but also hardship, corruption, war, democratic backsliding. There has been no Eastern European-style lustration in the intelligence services to keep the servants of the Soviet regime from power. And Yeltsin hands the acting presidency to the Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, former KGB colonel and FSB director. There have been a series of apartment bombings in Russia. Some of the circumstances are suspicious, suggesting possible FSB involvement. Putin has blamed Chechen militants, and as president positions himself as Russia's protector. He's elected president in March 2000. In June 2001, just a few months before 9/11, he meets George W. Bush in Slovenia. Bush announces that he looked Putin in the eye, found him to be straightforward and trustworthy, got a sense of his soul. Some years later, during his first presidential debate with Barack Obama, the Arizona Senator John McCain said he'd looked into Putin's eyes and seen the letters KGB. Should the U.S. and its allies have attached greater importance to Putin's past?
It's a good question. I mean, if you think of which of those descriptions has aged rather better, of course, Senator McCain was rather more perceptive. It can be argued with hindsight. Part of the thing is that, when you have this transition, inevitably, in most cases, and certainly in Russia's case, members of the former elite will probably endure into the new. I think that, and there's a very interesting point here, and I think you make a really, really interesting point about this sort of lustration process. And the reason why I say that is because in Russia, if you think about the satellite states, those who were more or less forced into being part of the Soviet bloc, as it came to be known, after the Second World War, for them, the end of the Cold War was a liberation. It was a change of system. It was also a liberation from one form of Russian imperialism. Now, the Russians did not have that similar liberation moment. I think Yeltsin tried to sort of hint at that when he was standing as president of the Russian Federation, rather than within the Soviet Union as it still remained then. And if you look at the countries surrounding Russia, those which are dominated by forcing them to accept its Soviet socialist system, they felt this liberation, and Russians were sort of left to say, well, actually, what are we supposed to liberate ourselves from? Well, we can liberate ourselves from the system, but there was also a lot of people who thought, well, actually, that was all we knew. We thought that was a perfectly good system, and we've just lost here. We've lost our territory, we've lost our global status. And some of the statistics about the number of officers, because of course, the Soviet army had army bases in all these places, since the end of the Second World War in the 1950s through the Cold War. One of the sources that I quote in the book, Dmitry Volkogornov, who was a colonel general in the Soviet, then Russian army, and also the author of a critical biography of Lenin, because he had access to the archives from the late Soviet period, ones that had not previously been available. He says that at one stage in the early 1990s, there are 180,000 Soviet officers who've returned from overseas, from abroad, without proper housing. Now, I think Putin, in addition to his sort of positioning himself as the sort of strong man who's going to deal with the Chechen rebels, he also, I think, understands very well the sense of humiliation. I mean, one can speculate about this. He possibly even understood it himself. He experienced it himself. He gives, in the summer of 2000, when he first becomes president, he gives an interesting series of interviews to 3 Russian journalists, published in the book, which was known as First Person. And one of the things he quotes is that he says, I understood that the country didn't exist anymore. And arguably, you can date his entire political outlook from that moment. And he spent the last quarter century and more trying to prove to everybody the country still does exist. The other thing he's done is he understood very well the political potential of that sense of humiliation that so many parts of society were experiencing.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the Putin era, we're at the beginning of a personalist regime where Putin's personal experiences, his personal prejudices, his personal hang-ups are going to be with us for decades. Right, so let's delve into his relationship with George W. Bush. One thing that comes across very clearly from the book is how much of the character of Putinism, down to the present, was formed in reaction to foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration. At first, Putin tries to curry favor with Bush by being the first to call him on 9/11 and present himself as an ally in the war on terror, off the back of the Chechen wars. Putin doesn't object to temporary U.S. bases in Central Asia during the war in Afghanistan. He also presumes that he has a right to have a say over bases that are not inside Russia. But the Iraq War, which unseats a long-standing Soviet ally, debtor, arms buyer, Saddam Hussein, triggers a deep anxiety in Putin about about U.S.-led regime change, which seems to be exacerbated by the two-color revolutions, the 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, the 2004-5 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, both of which unseat Kremlin-favored candidates. Putin blames those on the U.S. What I wonder is if Putin is already tipping his hand at this stage, revealing that he's more of an autocrat at heart than people are ready to realize, and that he actually expects the U.S. to want to overthrow him, if not now, at some point in the future. Is that anxiety a reflection of his intentions for the future of Russia?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing that did emerge from my research in the book, though, is just how much that period is a significant one. You know, you very rightly highlight there the fact that Putin was the first to call George W. Bush on 9/11. Really, really important expression of support, but also, as you say, a way in which he tries to somehow identify his wars against the separatists in Chechnya with the struggle, the military campaigns upon which the United States and its allies are about to embark. What I hadn't fully appreciated until I started researching this book was the extent to which the Iraq War can really be seen as a fracture point. The Jonathan Powell, who was former British Prime Minister Tony Blair's chief of staff for the entirety of his time in office, and is now the UK's national security advisor. He was very clear when I spoke to him in September 2023. He was certain that it was the Iraq War and the manner in which it was justified that was the fracture point between Putin and the West. And the reason he says that is because, you know, he felt that, you know, the West will justify these things along these lines, but actually you'll just go ahead and you don't really care about what we're doing. Now, there's another interesting side to this, Roland, which is also I spoke to Fiona Hill, of course, the presidential advisor on Russia to both President Obama and to President Trump in his first term. And she said, she recounts a very interesting visit to Moscow, during which it was clear that the Russian foreign intelligence knew that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. They assumed that the CIA and other Western agencies must know that too. And the fact that the Russian argument went, they knew there was no weapons of mass destruction there, and nevertheless, the United States and its allies continued with the war, was a suggestion confirmed to the Russians that they were acting in bad faith and that this was actually about regime change and not about weapons of mass destruction. And this is thought to have had a big effect on Putin, you know, in the sense in which you think, well, you know, they're going to use this as a justification to go to war on Saddam Hussein. One day it might be me. One day they might decide they want rid of me, so I'm going to, you know, look out for that. And then, of course, as you say, we have the Rose and Orange revolutions coming just, you know, in the years immediately after that.
It's tempting to think of Putin as being just appalled by Western bad faith. But on the other hand, this is someone who served in Andropov's 5th Directorate in Leningrad, policing dissidents, was in an organization built around deception.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is the thing with Putin, and a lot of, a lot of people wrote about that period, and a lot of people, you know, I interviewed have talked about how Putin was sort of open to these ideas and cooperation with the West. It's impossible to know if he was sincere. I've got no reason to think he wasn't sincere in offering support to George W. Bush on 9/11, for example. Mm-hmm. But thereafter, particularly we know what's come subsequently, it is tempting to wonder whether, given the background that he has and given the way that he tends to think, and increasingly, of course, he's thought in terms of these grand historical eras rather than just the time in which he finds himself. It's tempting to wonder if Putin was thinking at the time, I want to do something about this. I want to come back at this, but I'm not strong enough yet. This is not my time, but I'm going to play a very long game here. I'm going to watch what the West does very, very carefully. And then when my time comes, when my opportunity comes, I will take it.
I once attended an event at Chatham House with Michael Ignatieff. I don't remember what the event was about, really, but he used this interesting phrase, parodic politics, like the politics of parody. In other words, the idea was something like authoritarian regimes tend to feed the West back versions of its own policy in parody form.
Well, there's some really interesting echoes of that. One thing that, talking about seeing opportunities, you could mention, for example, Russia's intervention in Syria in 2015 when it turned the Syrian civil war decisively in favor of President Assad. Of course, that turned out only to be a sort of victory for the relative short term. And of course, President Assad was eventually driven from office and has ended up in exile in Moscow, of course. But I do remember being struck very much by some of the media coverage that the Russian Ministry of Defense, some of the video footage that they released. It seemed a conscious attempt to try to copy the footage that we'd seen, in earlier conflicts of, for example, missiles being launched from ships in the Mediterranean against targets in Iraq. And it was as if to say, look, and the release of a video from warplanes. It was as if to say, look, you've done that, we're going to do that. Look, we've even got the videos to show it. Here we are. We're doing the whole thing. And there was definitely a sort of, if not exactly a parodic element to that, then certainly a sort of, we can do this too.
Mm-hmm. Aesthetic parody.
Indeed.
Yeah. So in the second half of the 2000s, we have the high-profile imprisonment of Putin's critic Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the murder in Moscow of the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who's reported on the Second Chechen War, and the murder in London of Alexander Litvinenko, who has accused the FSB of blowing up the apartment buildings in the late 1990s. We also see rising tensions with neighbors. No more gas subsidies for Ukraine. If they don't pay the full rate, they get cut off in winter. There's a Russian spy scandal in Georgia that leads to Russian punishment of Georgian citizens. At the 2007 Munich Security Conference, Putin calls NATO enlargement a provocation. Ukraine and Georgia around this time are interested in joining NATO. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia are effectively told they can join NATO, but not when or how. And there are a couple of ways of looking at this. One is to say that NATO risks expanding by fits of absent-mindedness, biting off more than it can chew. The other is to say that there's a real point of principle at stake here, which is still not resolved, which is, are the countries of the former Soviet Union sovereign or not? What do you think?
And I think that's why that summit turned out, I think, in many ways, has been such a disaster. One of the former British ambassadors to Moscow and also a former prime ministerial advisor on foreign affairs, Sir Roderick Lyne, put it to me that this was one of the worst pieces of diplomatic drafting ever, for the reason being that, yes, you're absolutely right, Roland. There, of course, is a question of principle here that these countries must be allowed to decide what they want to do and what they can join. But on the other hand, NATO, by this curiously worded communique, doesn't really recognize that principle, because simply to say this is going to happen without saying how or when has the effect, arguably, of provoking Russia without actually offering any kind of guarantee to Georgia or Ukraine. And subsequently, of course, it's later that year already that Russia goes to war against Georgia and achieves its sort of aims there in terms of supporting separatists there and ensuring that Georgia is not in control of all of its territory. In fact, Russia even goes as far as recognizing two of those regions as independent countries, thereby making it very, very difficult to see how, in practice, Georgia could join NATO. I note that we're having this conversation in early 2026, and there's no serious talk now of Georgia joining NATO. And of course, Ukraine joining NATO is a whole other matter too, and that's something which seems pretty remote, to say the least. So I think in terms of that, yes, there is a point of principle at stake, but I think in the way that this was conducted, the European and US leaders of the time just didn't make it clear how this was, where they actually stood, and leaving this ambiguity, which, as I say, in effect, had the consequence of provoking Russia without providing security for the countries concerned.
Yeah, that's a good point. 2011 seems to be a signal year. Protests sweep parts of the Arab world, toppling dictators. Dmitry Medvedev, then Russia's president, is persuaded by the West to have Russia abstain from a UN Security Council vote, allowing Western allies to intervene militarily to protect civilians in Libya. This ends with Libyan rebels lynching the dictator Muammar Gaddafi, another Soviet ally. Putin is incensed and reportedly watches video of the lynching repeatedly. And it seems that his regime change fears, going back to the Iraq War, are triggered again. 2 months later, there are mass demonstrations in Moscow over fraud in the Duma elections, and Putin's plan to return as president. He blames the protests on then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Does this period mark Putin's slide into a more paranoid style of leadership?
I think it's a really, really important turning point for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of those mass demonstrations, we've never seen anything like that. They were the biggest demonstrations in Russia since the end of the Soviet period, and we've never seen anything like them since. And I think it is a massive turning point for Putin. It is also a massive turning point for Russia's liberal opposition, such as they are and such as they were, in the sense that they realise that things have possibly already gone too far and they don't have the sort of power that they thought. They thought that bringing this number of people out onto the streets would enable them to have a sort of critical mass. We've got two things. We've got, as you say, the allegedly fraudulent elections. Then we've got the fact that after Dmitry Medvedev has served one single 4-year term, we've got Putin saying, oh, by the way, I'm coming back, or at least Medvedev says it on his behalf. He says he's going to be nominating him for president. And I think at this point, a number of things happens in Russian politics and society. The people who have done rather well and have gone along with the sort of unspoken consensus of the Putin era, which is that, as long as you don't demand too many political freedoms or too much freedom of expression, you can be pretty sure of security and rising living standards. Again, this is something I think that Putin had understood very well in his first decade in power. He understood actually that's what many, many people wanted, a chance to make a decent living and a chance to have a degree of security. The end of communism coincides with widespread poverty, mass inflation, and hugely rising crime. Putin understands that. He understands that's what he needs to do. So he comes along, this tough guy, ex-KGB officer, saying, I'm going to sort this out, and he more or less does. He's helped massively by the fact that in his first decade in office, oil continues to rise, bringing money. I mean, you mentioned, Roland, at the beginning, they've been in Russia since the late Soviet period. I have never, ever, ever seen this Russian capital with that much money on the street. It was as if everybody, as soon as they got paid, went out and bought a car. The city that had hardly any cars at the late Soviet period, traffic jams were barely heard of. It was just choked with traffic. And I think at one stage, the police, the estimated 100,000 cars came in with commuters to the city every day. Mm-hmm. So we've got these huge rising living standards. Russians who hadn't been able to travel at all, politically, they were denied exit visas. Secondly, they couldn't really afford it because the currency wasn't worth very much and wasn't even convertible in Soviet times. Suddenly, they can go on holiday to Turkey, to Egypt, to Spain, wherever they feel like. They can afford these consumer goods. But then, and I think there's a feeling amongst, particularly the educated professional classes, that they allowed themselves to be had. But by the time they thought, we've still got some political power here, we can still bring tens of thousands of people out onto the streets. By the time they could still do that, it didn't have the effect it any longer did. And I think that's the point at which Putin thinks, I'm coming back. There's no sign then that he's going to go anywhere afterwards, and indeed he hasn't. And of course, subsequently, the constitution changes so that he can stay in office even longer.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk over the years of a so-called social contract between the Russian people giving up their freedoms and, Putin taking them in exchange for living standards. Stephen Kotkin likes to make the point that it's not really a contract because you can't enforce it.
Well, you can't.
It's broken.
Exactly. And I think at that point, the two interesting things happens. One, the people who've benefited from it and tacitly gone along with it realize that they can't enforce it. And secondly, from Putin's point of view, they've broken their side of the contract in the sense that, he's sort of thinking, and this is where this idea that, so frequent, and we've seen this in Iran again recently, that the idea that if, people are rising up because of political freedoms, because of, unbearable costs of living or whatever it is, then it can't be because they really feel like that. It's because the United States or whoever else is trying to stir it up. So in 2011, the people who are on the streets, from Putin's point of view, have broken their side of the deal. And the people on the streets, I think, suddenly realize, well, actually, maybe we signed up for this contract and now actually we can't get out of it.
Yeah. I mean, people who haven't been to Russia or who still have a Soviet era image of Russia in their head, or even an image from the 90s or 2000s. Well, I had a 10-year gap in my travels to Russia between around 2006 to 2016, and it was so different when I got back. And not only was it materially different, but it was culturally different. There was the lack of public drinking in many places where you used to see it. There was, people would stop at zebra stripes, where they used to try and run you over. So Russia had become, in some ways, like quite pleasant, to the point where you get propagandists like Tucker Carlson taking off to Russia, and this is more recent, but talking about how great the supermarkets are.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's impossible to overstate what a sort of searing image that left on Western conscious, those images from the late Soviet period of empty shelves and so on. I mean, I actually had quite a long gap as well. I had a gap of about 10 years between 2009 and 2019. And you'll remember, Roland, if you travelled there earlier, one quite common sight outside the metro, outside the subway stations, was litter bins on fire because somebody had thrown a cigarette end in there before going into the metro, because you couldn't smoke in the metro. And quite often, the papers in the bin had caught fire because the person hadn't bothered to extinguish the cigarette. The first evening I arrived in Russia at the beginning of a 3-week trip, on that occasion, I was walking in the center of Moscow and I saw this sort of bin smoking. I thought, oh, well, no, not everything's changed. I mean, the city was strikingly clean. The public transport was, punctual, clean, efficient. And I thought, okay, well, there's a couple of things that haven't changed. But actually, I was in Russia for nearly another 3 weeks and I didn't see that once again. So it's like that was the last sort of sign of, the sort of thing you're talking about, public drinking. I mean, actually, the statistics back that up. The World Health Organization published statistics in about 10 years or so ago to show how alcohol consumption had plummeted in Russia, and in consequence, male life expectancy, particularly male life expectancy, had increased, and that sort of sense of slightly chaotic lawlessness had really gone. But that was, lots of the money the money that was being generated was indeed being spent on public works. And talking about impressions and people going there, one big thing, of course, was the 2018 Football World Cup, the Soccer World Cup in 2018, when things were really sort of spruced up as part of, Russia putting on this big international sporting show.
Yeah. I caught just the very end of the burning bin era. I came in I saw one burning bin.
But you recognize the syndrome I'm describing.
Yeah. So in 2013, there are protests in Ukraine over Viktor Yanukovych's failure to sign an EU association agreement. Yanukovych's security forces crack down murderously. He ends up fleeing Russia in 2014. Putin calls it a coup d'etat, and in 2014 opportunistically seizes Crimea and backs separatist forces in Donetsk and Luhansk. Putin also begins talking about Prince Vladimir of Kiev, who supposedly baptized the ancient Rus in 988, forming the Russian Orthodox faith, and Ukraine's sacred place in Russian history. 2016, he erects a 57-foot statue of Prince Vladimir of Kiev outside the Kremlin. What's surprising in hindsight is that anyone thought this conflict was going to be contained in Ukraine's east. How did the West fail to face and plan for the unpleasant fact of Putin's wider ambitions in Ukraine?
I mean, I think the short answer to that, it was just so hard to believe because, from many points of view, it's hardly been in Russia's interest. The idea was that, after the end of the Cold War, increased commercial ties would mean that, and it was in a way, it was an export version of the model that brought peace to Western Europe after so many years. The idea that if we trade together, we will have little or no incentive to go to war, and that obviously hasn't turned out to be so. I think, I think in the early stages, yes, the annexation of Crimea was important because it was something that had historically been part of Russia and then had been transferred to Ukraine. But during the Soviet period, so it was more symbolic than obviously it was as after the end of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was an independent country. It's something that was already very dear to Russian hearts. People, the sort of. People would often say when I was going on a trip from Moscow to Ukraine, sometimes people would say to me, "Oh, ask them to give us Crimea back." And after the annexation, again, I think one will perhaps come on to the fact as to whether Putin's political instincts have deserted him or not. But this is after 2011. This is after all that dissatisfaction. In the short aftermath of the annexation of Crimea, his approval ratings go up to 86%. I mean, it's astonishing. And this is a man who's been in power by this stage for, well, if you count his period as acting president, pretty much best part of 15 years. Yeah. And he's enjoying that. And this is popular right across. There must, statistically, have been tens of thousands of those people who came out to that freezing square in late 2011 to protest against the Duma election, the parliamentary election results. A lot of them must have been part of the same strata of society who, after that, we're talking 2.5 years later, when Crimea is annexed, are saying, yes, this is good, we approve of this. This is what Russia should be doing internationally. But at that point, I think, and we see the conflict, the unrest in the Donbass. I think, it was reasonable to conclude at that time that what Putin was really about was to weaken Ukraine in the way that the support for the separatists in Georgia had done in 2008. Longer term strategic effect of that is making sure that Georgia is very, very difficult for Georgia to join NATO. In the Donbass and the eastern regions of Ukraine, Putin has an area where, if you like, he can turn up the heat, rather like in a pan of boiling water. You can turn up or down the gas according to how much you want it to bubble over, and that he creates that opportunity there with the proxies that the Kremlin has there. And I think sometime between then and 2022, this idea of much more bigger, greater ambition for invasion and domination occurs, and with the consequences that we will see eventually in 2022.
I remember some Western journalists saying just after the full-scale invasion, we thought he was just a kleptocrat. In other words, they thought he cared only about money. They thought that he was bound primarily by economic interest. That turned out to be a rationalist illusion.
I mean, lots of people have looked at the timing of this and remember. I mean, I'm sure you remember, Roland, that curiously long table at which Putin would receive guests during the pandemic, and the memes that it generated, because it did look rather funny, with a massive long table and people sitting at the other end of it. But there's no question that during the pandemic, there were famously strict quarantine requirements for anybody who's going to come into his presence. And also, so there's this sort of physical isolation that, of course, many of us experienced to a greater or lesser degree during the pandemic. But in Putin's case as well, I think there's a sort of isolation of power too. By this stage, he's been in power for 20 years. He's reached a stage where, people will be pretty unwise to contradict him. And I think he starts perhaps, and I'm very, very reluctant to sort of subscribe to the amateur psychology that accompanies analysis of so much of Putin's thinking. But it is true to say that after that pandemic, he starts to write these essays, which clearly are the precursor to some greater neo-imperialist ambitions. And there's that
essay was quite a tell in hindsight.
It was quite something, really, wasn't it? It was pretty obvious about, which way things were going. And you can see the way, and that was very telling about the way in which he thinks. And you've already mentioned the medieval chronicles. He starts to draw on these and apply, their relevance as he sees it to contemporary international politics. And I'm sure you've seen that. That's a really striking quote that was in the Financial Times on the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion, attributed by a nameless oligarch who had apparently heard this from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who we're led to believe was himself kept at arm's length from the decision to escalate the war in Ukraine, aside, of course, from that time on TV just a couple of days before, when everybody had, in effect, to sign up to the idea in the most public of ways. But he's supposed to have told this oligarch, who was the Financial Times source, that Putin, has three advisors: Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Catherine the Great. In other words, all people who've transformed Russia and acquired more territory. And so that, according to Lavrov, according to this story, and certainly, the historical essays, the references to the medieval chronicles, do make that quite sort of believable. Those are the terms in which he thinks. He thinks in terms of his historical reputation. But it's also interesting to speculate if he had not gone ahead with the full-scale invasion, he could have gone down in history as the Russian leader who brought Crimea back into the Russian Federation. Even if Western governments said they didn't recognize the annexation, in effect, in practice, very little changed. Nobody suggested boycotting the World Cup in 2018 because Crimea had been annexed, and so on. And again, I think you'll find a lot of senior Western policymakers who'll think that things could have been done differently then, but they weren't. And that was largely expected. Putin could possibly have settled for that, but there's other things he could have done. He could have left office after 2 terms in 2008 and gone down as the president who brought Russia to become a society where people did their constitutional 2 terms and left office. But things haven't turned out like that, of course.
I don't think anyone thought that was going to happen.
I don't think they did. Because as somebody sort of quite close to the Kremlin who used to speak to us Western journalists at the time said, he said to me rather sort of provocatively in late 2007, just before, when Medvedev had been nominated as the presidential candidate, he said to me, the Putin era is only just beginning. And those words have echoed through my mind very, very many times since. But this person also pointed out that, Russian history is such that you've never had a leader who was alive, popular, and out of office. So, Gorbachev and Yeltsin both enjoyed their periods of popularity at the time, both very, very unpopular at the time when they left office, and subsequently did not have a big role in public affairs. And most, of course, most of the Communist Party general secretaries died in office, as indeed, of course, did the Tsars and emperors before that.
Yeah. That's a good place to leave it, James. Well, I think we're going to ask you one more question. Russia was a huge part of your life. Very few of us are traveling back to Russia anymore. I'm certainly not.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Like, this country has kind of, how should I put it? It's almost like it's not in the world anymore.
It's not in my world anymore, unfortunately. It's in my thoughts a lot, and I'm going to continue to work on it and write about it. But how do I feel about that? That's a really good question, Roland. It's something I do think about a lot. Actually, I think the truth is I feel 2 things. I feel tremendously privileged to have the opportunities that I've had to travel there. I first went there in 1987 when I was a Russian language student, landing in Leningrad before it was called St. Petersburg again. And then, I had opportunities to travel there in the 1990s and the 2000s, which have been afforded to very, very few Westerners in the whole of history. So in that sense, I feel very lucky and very privileged to have witnessed that. And now I have to say, in all my life, and I was obviously born during the Cold War, I'm in my late 50s now, I feel very sad that I think I may well not see it again. And I think it's also at any time in my life, I was born in the 1960s, at no time in my life has it been as hard for, I'm British, I'm a British national, but for Westerners in general to be, to travel to Russia. It's never been that hard. Even in the Soviet times, you could still go on sort of cultural exchange programs. So I feel privileged what I've had, and sad at the fact that I can't travel there anymore. But I can't really imagine the circumstances which I would, while the war in Ukraine continues in the way that it does. And even after that, we're going to have a long period, until Russia's relations with Russia are normalized again. I mean, I put this to anyone I have this conversation with. I say, well, can you imagine, when will it be the next time that you can go to Heathrow Airport to the west of London and take a direct flight to Moscow? And I don't think anyone's got an answer to that question.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thanks, James. So this is Return of Russia. It's a great overview of the last 35 years. It's a very useful book. It's very useful for drawing connections between the events of that period. So you can find James online at jamesrogersauthor.com, on X and Instagram, both at jmacrogers, on Bluesky at jmacrogers.bsky.social. You can find me on X at Roland E. Brown, on Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown, and you can read my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. Thanks very much, James.
My pleasure, Roland. Thank you very much.